Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of the Beards and Cars podcast, which of course you can grab if you choose to in its audio-only form from SoundCloud via the link below. But for those of you who do choose to watch or listen to it in the background on YouTube, I want to thank you for that because it is, for the moment at least, more beneficial for the channel. And this is a community-suggested topic, combined with a discussion which I've had a number of times, tangentially, regarding the classes and categories of vehicle within Gran Turismo. And of course, the main thing that I usually bring up is Group X and the way that it doesn't really work properly. However, this discussion is much more than that because we're going to consider a little bit of the past, we're going to consider the current situation, and then crucially, as you'll have seen from the title and the thumb, we're going to look to the future, make some predictions, maybe reason it through, slap your thoughts down in the comments of course, and have some discussions or debates down there. What do you think is going to happen in GT7 in particular? Now, GT7 is rumoured to be a launch title with the PS5, and I believe it's at the very least strongly rumoured, if not confirmed, that the PS5 is coming November of this year. So, if those two rumours collide and turn out to be true, that could well mean that by the end of this year we will have a Gran Turismo 7. We'll have to wait and see on that, of course, but it is a very fair point to think of how will those categories work, and the reason why it's a fair discussion to have is because it's a pretty big point of contention for GT Sport players. Not just myself, but I know many of you guys have qualms with certain specific vehicles that are already in the game or that are added to the game in updates. Well, they just don't make sense. There are some obvious ones like the BMW i3, which was already in the game. Why is that in Group X? It makes no sense. Some people use the logic that, well, because it's an electric car, it couldn't really pit in properly, so it doesn't seem fair. At the same time, though, I must admit, I'm not a fan of that logic at all, because we had electric cars in GT6, such as the Tesla and the Fisker, and they worked just fine. They were within the same classes and categories as everything else, and when you pit in, it just charges the battery at the same rate as a fuel tank. And you could say, well, that's not realistic. Well, of course it's not. But if you're really going to start being semantic over something like that, you cannot then overlook the fact that you can run at 200 miles an hour around a wall in Tokyo and use that as a way of taking a corner. That's not realistic either, but you can still do it. So you can't pick and choose what realistic things you do and don't want. It's either going all out, or you choose to allow some select, logical, unrealistic things, such as having a battery that charges too quickly to allow the car to still compete. I see no issue with that, and at the end of the day, it's not like the Tesla is going to beat everything out there in N400, or a Fisker, or a BMW i3. It just allows them to have, well, let's be honest, a lot more use than they currently do, because in Group X, they have no use at all. At the same time, though, I find it very interesting to note that it's not just Group X which is fundamentally flawed. There are actually a number of categories in GT Sport which simply do not work as efficiently or as fairly as they could be. And although, of course, the idea of the categories that we have is new, for the most part, to the game, so there are going to be teething issues, at the same time, you should learn from those in the next game, and hopefully they will do that. Currently, as an example, there is no legitimate reason to have classic Group C prototypes going up against Vision GT prototypes and LMP1s, all within Group 1. That, put simply, is not fair. They are by definition vehicles from totally different eras, with totally different approaches to performance, a different rulebook even, and in many ways it's actually a system where games from over a decade ago, in fact almost 2 decades ago, did it better than games are now. Take TOCA, for example, TOCA Race Driver 3, the classes made sense. The vehicles that actually should be racing each other raced each other. And I find it very curious that you could even argue that the past of Gran Turismo did a better job of classes and categories than the current one does. And I'm not just talking about performance points. Think back to, for instance, Gran Turismo 2. Back then it used a fairly similar system. You had cars that were or were not allowed based on, more than anything else, power. Almost like an evolution of the N-Class system. Then, in GT3 and 4 though, there wasn't really a class system at all. There were no performance points, and the races were more than anything else based on whether or not the car should compete or not. If it was a one-make race, a manufacturer event, a particular era, a particular type of car, and to me that's a far more efficient system. To the point where, even to this day, I never hear people complaining about the class and category system in GT3 and 4, because there pretty much wasn't one. The cars that were allowed made sense, and it was as simple as that. Then, though, Gran Turismo 5 comes along and introduces the performance point or PP system. And of course that was further refined, you could say, in GT6 as well. You had everything from technically 0 points, but I believe it was more like 100 as a base, all the way up to 999, theoretically at least. And that is very similar to Forza. But I do find the Forza system actually to be a little bit better in some ways, and that is that Forza almost has a redundancy, or especially they used to in like the Forza 4 days, where you'd have points, but then there were also classes. So, for example, just like Gran Turismo, the vehicle's rating could be anywhere between 100 points and 999, but at each major interval, the car changed categories as well. So, for instance, the road cars could span anything between F all the way up to A. And then there was S category, which is like supercars and stuff like that, or at least a road car that's tuned up to a supercar level. And of course, vehicles could go up and down through categories depending on how you tune them. F is the slowest, S is the fastest, and then you enter the R classes. Back in the older Forza games, there was R4, which is like low level, like BTCC touring car type stuff, cup cars. And then, of course, you have R3, which is like the GT3 level stuff, kind of like Group 3 in GT Sport. Then you had R2, which is like Super GT stuff, and even some technically not race cars, but kind of the same level, like the Koenigsegg CC GT or the Zonda R, Ferrari F50 GT, that sort of stuff. Again, fairly similar to what Gran Turismo Sport has with Group 2, but in that case, for the moment at least, it's just Super GTs. Then you had the highest technical racing category in Forza, which was R1. And as you'd expect, R1, much like Group 1, is basically reserved for prototypes. Group Cs, LMPs, maybe even something like a Daytona prototype if it were eligible or had a high enough point category. And you could get some hypercars into that category if they had a high enough spec, but they weren't usually as competitive. You know, try and take a Veyron up against a Sauber C9 and you're going to lose no matter how much power it's got. And then the highest class in the game, which was originally classed as Class U or Ultimate 999, it was later changed to X 999, and that was reserved in the older games for stuff like the TVR Speed 12. In the later games, you could get prototypes into that category by like de-restricting the power, making the weight a little bit lower, that kind of stuff. So it was a class system that worked very, very well. Where Gran Turismo differed from that, in particular I'll use GT6 as an example, is it had a similar structure where it ranged from 100 up to 999 theoretically, although if I recall correctly, I don't think any car actually was that high. Even the Red Bull was like 980 or something, I think. But there were no subcategories. It was just performance points, and it just scaled up through the board. And that was great. It still worked very well, but there were definitely some cars which kind of slipped through the cracks. A couple of the notable examples would be stuff like the Suzuki GSX R4, the original Ford Focus RS, the Mazda RX 500, and to me the most ridiculous one of all, the Red Bull X2014 Junior, which had a higher class rating than a Chaparral 2J. I mean, forget it. The car did not stand a chance. It was like 736 points, which is higher than most of the Le Mans prototypes, and of course it cannot beat them. It's like a 250 horsepower go-kart, in effect. But the fact remains that out of 1,200 total vehicles, the reason why we can remember stuff like the Red Bull Junior as standing out so much is because it didn't actually happen that often. For the most part, PP points worked very well. It was a fair system for the most part, and to have 1,200 cars that can comfortably work under that category system, if you will, just an overarching list of points, that's quite the achievement, I think. They introduced it in GT5, certainly refined it in GT6, but then we jumped into this totally new system in GT Sports, which in a funny kind of way feels like a melding of what Forza does with the overarching classes, but then in a weird way, it regressed back to Gran Turismo 2, because it factors in power rather than points. And although that initially seems like a cool idea, it's actually an awful idea, because you have, as I've mentioned before, vehicles within the same categories that simply don't make sense. You should not have a Charger Hellcat in the same category as a Pagani Huayra. That just doesn't make sense. Yes, they are both 200 mile an hour, 700 horsepower cars, but that is all they have in common. It does not make sense to have them in there. Then at the same time, of course, you have, as I mentioned, Group C cars against modern LMPs, which is immediately unfair, but then also, to make things even worse, you've got Vision GT cars thrown in there, which have no realistic parameters. They're completely fictionalized vehicles. How is that even fair? Even in Group 3, you've got vehicles which for the most part make sense, but then you've got a Ford GT Spec 2 thrown in there, and probably the weirdest one of all, the McLaren F1 GTR, a Le Mans winning GT1 machine shoved into Group 3 alongside GTE Spec or GT3 Spec, Nissan GTRs and Corvettes, and even though the performance may be similar, it still doesn't really work like that because it's a totally different category of vehicle. It's, for instance, like having a Group 2 category where you put a GT300 REM Yamaha RX-7 against a GT500 Lexus SC430 purely because they're both Super GT cars. That's just not fair. Plus, there are inherent flaws in terms of future-proofing the system. Where on earth do you put NASCARs? It doesn't make sense to put them into a Group 5 because that would indicate, based on the current listing, that they're lower than Group 4, and Group 4 is already like BTCC or GT24 touring car style, so that wouldn't make sense either. You can't put them into Group 3 because they're not competitive enough. You certainly couldn't put them into Group 2, so chances are, if there were a NASCAR in GT Sport, or even multiple ones, they'd either have to have a completely new class, like a Group N, which I don't see them doing, or Group X, because the precedent is there. Anything that already doesn't fit snugly into the existing system, such as a drift car or a time attack Subaru, they get dumped into Group X. And unfortunately, for Polyphony at least, that is not going to fly in the next game. So I'm really curious to now move into the next part of the discussion, which is the future. Predictions, discussions, reasoning on what you think the next game, in terms of this aspect, could look like. Now, as we move into this aspect of the discussion, I believe that there is one crucial point that needs to be brought up, because it's something which some of you may not know. It's something which, if you do know, you've probably already commented about it, and it's something which some of you may have even forgotten. But that is, in the early days of GT Sport, back in the pre-demo, more like beta stage, and you can even find images of this on Google, there actually was a performance point system that was planned to be implemented into the game, as well as the classes. That would have been very reminiscent to Forza, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because it works very well on Forza. So, at least the infrastructure is clearly there to some degree in terms of having that moving forward. Now, maybe they plan to implement the points system more in a traditional Gran Turismo game than into this offshoot, which is what GT Sport, for more or less, ended up being more of an FIA-based online experience, with the career mode being very much an afterthought. So, there is a strong possibility, I think, that we will see a similar class structure in the next game, but maybe with points as well. However, that brings up a potential problem immediately, because if you've got N classes, for instance, but also PP points, which one dominates? Because you could have a class system where, as I said, a 700 horsepower Charger is against a 700 horsepower Huayra. That's fair enough in terms of power. It's not fair, but you know what I mean. Technically, they are both N700. However, there is no way the points on those two cars are going to even be remotely close. So which one takes precedent? That is where the issues come into play. Because the points system could work pretty comfortably, in fact, within the GR classes. Group 3, Group 4, Group 1, and even technically a Group X or some kind of replacement for it. You could justifiably have the points within those. In the road car classes, it just doesn't work in the same way because by definition, road cars are not running under any kind of racing regulation. They're running under safety regulations, environmental regulations, And that's about it. Beyond that, manufacturers can pretty much build whatever they want. So there is no way that you could have a system which uses both, at least that I can think of, that could work seamlessly together. One must take precedent over the other. And that makes me think that for the next game, and this is going to be one of my predictions, I believe they're actually going to do away with the N classes. I do believe, though, they may keep the group classes, because they work, for the most part, better. So, what I believe could happen in GT7 is I think we will probably retain a Group 4, Group 3, Group 2 and Group 1, with performance points potentially in there as well, but maybe even no performance points, they might be their own thing entirely, but then just the street cars, what would have been the N classes from N100 up to N1000, I believe could well become a PP system once again. And to me that would actually work far more efficiently, because currently there are simply certain vehicles that are way too OP, they always will be, stuff like Porsche RSs for example. At the same time, there are cars which can and should be allowed to race against those which are not. I mean, something like the Subaru drift car, yes, it is powerful, it has a big engine, it has a lot of downforce, but I still don't find that car to be necessarily as competitive as a hypercar, for instance. So allowing it into the N classes or even a PP system, I don't think would be a bad thing. The Time Attack Subaru, for example, you could quite easily have that as, for instance, one of the highest PP point vehicles in the game, because it doesn't really fit into a racing class, but at the same time, why not have it as a really high level PP vehicle, like a 900 or 800 or whatever, so that would be above stuff like your Huayras and LaFerraris, because that's how quick the car is. So I believe there is a way that you could make the system work far more efficiently to actually appease far more people, and let's be honest, make a lot of these cars far more useful than they currently are. The interesting question still arises though, as far as the other classes, stuff which we don't have, like, for instance, a proper Formula class, or even multiple Formula classes. Formula E, which of course was rumoured and presumably confirmed but still isn't here. The obvious one of NASCAR. What if they want multiple rally classes? There was a new rally class rumoured a while back, a Group N. Well, it might happen. I don't think it will at this point in the game, but possibly in the next one. Group B, I think, works pretty well for the most part. There's only one car that stands out, and that is, of course, the Audi Quattro. But apart from that, I'd say it's a pretty fair class. It doesn't get the kind of use that it deserves compared to the others, but it works for the most part. You could quite easily have a Group A and a Group B, maybe like different rally cars, maybe even a Group S, like Pikes Peak stuff. So I don't think the rally stages and rally classes really need that much change. They work pretty well. Group 3 I think is pretty good for the most part. Again, you could have PP points within that to make it even more reliable, but it's not a necessity. Group 2, for instance, could comfortably be GT500s and modern DTM cars, considering that the rule books are coming together anyway, so that would make sense. But then you still have the issues of like Group 1 Modern versus Group 1 Classic. So for me, it really does come back to, if I was personally making a class system for the game, I believe that the best choice to go for is actually the one that's almost 2 decades old, the TOCA method. TOCA has a more efficient and more just way, in effect, of classifying competition vehicles than Forza or Gran Turismo have ever had, because, put simply, TOCA Race Driver 3 in particular had a far more reliable and far fairer and more realistic system of either allowing or not allowing the exact type of competition vehicle that should be in that class. You don't put a prototype in with the Group C, or more specifically an LMP in with the Group C. That would have never happened in TOCA 3, as far as I can recall. You had stuff like GT3s together, race trucks together, exactly as it should be. And although even myself, I will say that a part of me doesn't like the idea of losing the mismatched multicultural racing engine that, for instance, a Gran Turismo 4 had, where you could legitimately have like a V8 supercar, a GT3 car, a prototype, a GT1, all within the same race, with an Escudo in there as well. That is one of the most reminiscent things of Gran Turismo, having this mismatch of race cars together. But at the same time, they're already moving away from that anyway. They already have Group 3 as its own thing. They already have Group 1 as its own thing, so they're already moving in that direction anyway. I just think that if you're going to do that, do it properly. Overall, though, I think that's it for my thoughts. My biggest prediction, as I mentioned, is I believe that the next game will retain the group classes, probably 4, 3, 2, and 1 at least. I hope, beyond all hope, that they do not include Group X because it has no place in the game. I hope that they restructure the N classes, and I will predict even that they will start to use a point system again instead of power because it just makes way more sense and it's so much more fair. Overall, I'm going to predict that, but I'm going to hope for it even more. So we'll have to wait and see. Tell me your thoughts down below. Do you think I'm aiming too high with my hopes? Do you think it's going to be worse? Do you think they'll keep the same system? What do you think about NASCAR? What do you think about multiple rally types? What will they do with that kind of stuff? But overall, that's it for this installment. Of course, I'll see you next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.